Welcome to the Boring AF Politics Podcast. I'm Dr. Dave Hayes, and I got my colleague, Dr. Rich Ledet here. Say hello.
Hello, guys.
All right. And what we're going to talk about today is polling accuracy. And this is something that has come up in recent years. There's been a lot of doubt cast on polls. And so today I've got some information here from a couple sources. And I'm springing a lot of this on Rich. In a perfect world, I'd have sent all of these slides to him ahead of time, but none of us live in that world, or I certainly don't. So let's talk, though, about that question of, how accurate are polls? And so just to start out with some data, just some observations of polls. 538 looked at polling about a year ago, and after the 2020 election, and they looked at it and they said, one, they were remarking that the 2022 election was in fact fairly accurate. But they were, in looking back at these things, they have a lot of charts and they have different things. But just looking at presidential elections, what we have here is what they found for the poll accuracy, right? So in the last 21 days, and this is their window, the polling in the last 21 days of the election, when they were predicting, who people would vote for, what the weighted average is of how much they were off. They also had a separate chart showing bias, right? Because you can be off, right? If you have one poll that's over 5, another poll that's under 3, that's 8. That's 8 off, right? It's an absolute value, and you average that out, and right. The thing is, though, are they consistently off in one direction or another? That's the bias, and the bias tends to be, as we'll see, much smaller than lack of accuracy or inaccuracy. Just looking at this, what we see is generally the polls, we go through a period, we have 4.4%, then we have some threes. We get to 2016, it starts going up. We have 4.9, and 2020, we get a 5 point. So 2020 is, by their measure, the most inaccurate poll set of polls since 1998 when we compare it to the vote. Meanwhile, on bias, we see that previous bias, we've had Republicans in 2000 and 2012. The polls gave a biased answer. They overestimated Republican chances about 2%, 2.5%. In other elections, we had Democratic bias, but in 2008, it's practically nothing. 2004, not that much. 2016, though, and 2020, we see very strong bias towards the Democratic candidate, right? And so they point out here that, look, the polls aren't consistently biased. They've gone back and forth over the years. We have, in looking at this sample, we have 2 Republican leaning polls, sets of polls, right? This is all the polling that goes on in their list. And it's 2 out of 4, and that's one off of 50-50, right? If it was perfectly random, it'd be 50-50, it'd be 3 and 3. We're close to that. So they say the bias is not that baked into the system, right? And let me just show one more thing before I ask Rich for his thoughts on this. Um, well, here's the poll accuracy for 2020, which they say is the most inaccurate set of polling. Here we have the different races, right? And they're looking at the polling for the various races. So there's the president, the average error in 2020 was 5 points. But for Senate, it was 5.8. For House seats, it was 6.5. And for governors, it was 6.4, right? So the presidency was not uniquely, it wasn't. And one argument is it's not just about Trump, right? That it's these other races that are off. And we see in 2022 a drop there. And one more here, um, poll party bias, 2020 versus 2022, the last two. Now, to midterm elections, we can't compare president to president, but we do have Senate, House, and governor races. In 2020, the poll bias for Senate races 4.9 in the Democratic direction. That's the blue. I hope that was obvious to everyone. Blues for Democrats versus a slight bias towards Republicans at the Senate level. House level 6.1 versus 0.02. Again, not even worth mentioning, but this is the Democratic way. The only place we had anything a bias that starts being worth mentioning is at the governor races. Uh, and we see in 2020 there was a 5.6% bias towards Democrats, and in 2022 1.3. So there we go. That's a long-winded thing, but what do you think, Rich?
I guess I'm with this slide. I'm really shocked that it's so hard to guess who's gonna win the House seat. That to me is odd. But if you go back a slide,
Um, well, I will say one thing about that. This is not calling the election. They had a separate slide, and
okay.
78% of polls always they tend to call elections properly,
Mhm.
right? This is predicting the vote count.
Okay.
This is
Um,
comparing vote count to the poll estimate of what the vote will be.
and the first slide, the bias. So in 2000, the bias is in favor of the Republican candidate.
Yep.
Um, Before 2000, there was a Democratic president. The bias in 2004 is towards the Democrat. Up until that point, you had a Republican president. The bias in 2008 is in the Democratic direction. Up until that point, you had a Republican president.
But the bias is 0.9
I
there.
know, but it's still there, right? But and that's margin of error. I'm going to wipe that away. The bias in
Right.
2012
That's
reflects
middle of
the
a
opposite candidate, the opposite party is what I'm saying. Like, why does, I mean, do we have enough to say that this is a trend? The
no.
bias
I'm going
in
to say no, we don't. That
2016.
we have six. Uh, and I think that's an important point.
Mhm.
All presidential elections, there's so few of them,
Yeah.
right?
But in each one of these cases, I do believe the bias is in favor of the party that's not in power at the time of the election. And that just could be an artifact, but that's what strikes me as odd. And I mean, am I right? 3, 4, yep.
Um,
That was Obama. Bias toward Republicans. That was Obama again. No, 2016. The bias is in favor. So that's the only one that's off. But that's the first thing I saw.
yeah.
When I see that is because I'm wondering if pollsters are kind of maybe there's an implicit bias, but I
Well,
could just be
is it the pollsters or the respondents?
yes, exactly.
And
You know,
well, let's get to the question. As we would have said in the army, if the 2020 polling was 8, slap the f up. Uh, you know, uh, then if it was all ate up, which apparently eating nowadays has a different meaning for kids. Eating means to do very well. Like if pollsters were eating, they would be that would be 2022. But all right, so if we want to look at this question of where did the epic errors in 2020 come from, we have the American Association for Public Opinion Research. They commissioned a report with a dozen folks from different universities. You can go to the site and look this up. Um, and they tried to come up with reasons and they looked at things to try to say, why was 2020 so bad? And in typical social science fashion, it's easier to say what wasn't a factor than what was. And so I've kind of got this list of things that we can go through here. First of all, they said it was not error caused by late deciding voters. It wasn't that suddenly late deciding voters said, "Hey, I'm going to vote for a Republican candidate." They looked at they looked at the available data to say, would that have been if these people had been more if they've been polled later? Do we see that? They looked at exit polls and they're like, no, not that. By the way, that's just historically that is why the polls this problem is what bedeviled the polls in Reagan's first election going into the weekend or the weekend before the election. The polls all had Reagan losing to Carter,
to Carter.
and then he won by pretty much a landslide. So, but so it wasn't this thing, and I hope we can just move past that. All right, here's one that I think got a lot of talk, especially amongst Republicans who didn't like. Because remember, in the run up to the 2020 election, the polls are all showing Biden killing Trump, right? Just wiping him out. And there was a lot of pushback that the polls are wrong, the polls, and the skewing came up, right? That was something that was argued, that the polls were not getting enough Republicans in them, that they were getting more educated voters who tended to vote for Biden, that they weren't waiting based on these things. And so this is actually 2 points they made. First, it's, they separately dealt with the question of education. They also looked at other assumptions, and they looked at it and said, "Is it that were the polls, you know, uh, incorrectly weighting? Were we getting samples that were skewed towards Biden supporters?" They said no as well to that. Got nothing.
I mean, this is real boring. This is real boring stuff.
well,
But
well,
I guess it just because I guess the first thing that pops into my head is the difference between what we do as social scientists and what political pundits who work in the news and journalism and infotainment realm
yeah.
are always looking for something to talk about. And I would again remind the audience something that you and I have talked about before. We should not use these polls to predict the future. So, but pollsters are pretty good about knowing what the electorate looks like.
Right.
I mean, and our best, probably our best, not even guess, but our best, we all pay for the census. You know,
Mm,
making sure that you, in terms of the demographic variables I see there, like the census has a pretty good handle, not perfect, but the
right.
census has a pretty good handle on who lives in this country, where they live, and what they look like.
Mm,
So, I'm just like, for me, that was never the issue with the polling. I always come back to, I don't trust people are telling the truth, right?
well, we'll
Because
get to that.
yeah, that's what, but that could also introduce that allows pundits to have different conversations once
Yeah,
social scientists have already looked at the data, compared the data. Hey, this is not a problem. That doesn't mean the pundit class isn't still talking about that.
that is
You
true.
know. So, but I don't. I got nothing besides
But we do
conspiratorial speculation on this one.
we do have they did go and look at the data, and they were able to say no, we're seeing the assumptions were about right, and so it wasn't that. The other thing, and this is something else that was talked about at the time,
Yeah,
that there was a concern that people were so vilified for supporting Trump that when they were on a phone call with a complete stranger, they would be ashamed to say that they supported Trump. Now, I'm already skewing this. I'm already telling you what I think. I thought about that argument at the time, because I just said, our Trump. Well, one, he was the president at that time,
yeah,
right? So I felt saying you're going to reelect the president, even though the guy's controversial. I don't know. And I also am like, I didn't know that Trump supporters were so bashful. That was this is it, with no hate, no shade cast on anyone, but bashful is not the word that comes to mind. Um, the thing is that you've got this was an issue, right? And they were able to look at that, and the primary way they oh, kind of debunked this was what we had at the beginning, looking at the differences between polling on Trump and polling on other people. And
yeah,
they found that, actually the polling was better on Trump than it was on other people. So it clearly wasn't idiosyncratic to Trump. And that, oh, I'm ashamed to say I'm going to vote for Trump, but not ashamed to say I'm going to vote for Mitch McConnell. In fact, the polling would have suggested, if there was anything, it was the other way, right? That because there was less error with Trump. So that was completely debunked. And a better way, it's better to debunk or to falsify. We don't say debunk, we would say falsify a theory, falsify a hypothesis, than it is to just argue against it, right? Because my little casual, I don't think the Trumper, that's anyone can do that. That's not very scientific. What is scientific is pointing to evidence. Hey, look, here's the weighted error for Trump, and then here is the weighted error for other different levels of
Mhm.
office. And if if the Trump thing, if the Trump shame was real, we'd see a difference. There would be an observable difference. We
Yeah.
don't see it. Therefore we well, we were supposed to accept the null hypothesis. Let's not get that far into it. um but yes, I intend to use this section as a clip in one of my classes, so I took that moment.
Well,
um
but that was also a narrative that what I think was developed over time. Again, that was a media narrative that there was Trump shame out there.
right.
But I live in District 2 here in Alabama. There's no Trump shame here.
No.
You know?
and and honestly, that reflected, I forget, they had a name for it. The young, or it was, there was a black candidate running for governor in Virginia, and the polls all showed he was going to win, and then the outcome went the other way. And
Mhm.
this was 80s. This was years and years ago. And there, that this idea that this kind of idea was used to explain why polls were off when measuring support for African American candidates. That somebody would get on the phone and not want to say they were not going to vote for this guy, because they would think, oh, this person will think I'm a racist, and so you over report your willingness to vote to make this person feel better in in the poll, in the interaction. And uh and and so that is something. And by the way, that went away, right? That effect had been, was something that people measured and observed, but not anymore, right? And so at one point that was a total thing. Now people are skeptical of it, and it was kind of a similar thing was dusted off here. So a little history lesson there from the old guy. Moving on, and it wasn't turnout.
Yeah.
They said, look, we can't explain the polling error by errors in estimating whether Democratic or Republican respondents were going to go vote, right? Whether they were actually vote. And they looked at the filters, and they looked at the available data and said, no, the likely voter filters seem to be okay, right? And
Yeah.
so they felt they had enough information to say, yeah, this kind of matches. So it's not that. And it wasn't early voting, right? They didn't see any, they're like, one argument was that the polls, and it kind of related to that people splitting, that the polls had too few election day voters, too many. Because if you recall, a lot of people might not remember, we probably blocked it from our minds. Um, it took forever to figure out who won because they were counting all those early ballots, and Trump started out with a huge lead on election night, and then it went away as you counted. And so there was a big difference.
What did they call that, ballot dumps or massive dumps or something or
Something. And um, Trump voted that way
yeah,
himself,
exactly.
but a lot of people mailed in because what was going on in 2020. So we're going to forget this, right?
COVID.
Yeah. Um, so now we get into what they think. So one partial answer they've got, and this goes back to we were talking earlier. How do people react to you? How do respondents react to the pollster? They argued their data suggested that at least some of the polling error was caused by unit non-response, right? Which is uh, calling a phone number and being hung up on.
Mhm.
And I don't know how they quite get at this. I didn't drill deep enough down into it, but they said there is some evidence that people were not, that the people who are refusing to answer the polls are themselves more likely to be Trump supporters. Therefore, they are self-selecting. In a large number of them are opting out of answering the poll, and that may be part. They said at least some of it comes from this, right?
I can agree with that. I can
And
see that happening.
related to this, they did find that the normal factors that had been used before to predict non-response sucked. Just I'll just cut to the chase. They
Yeah,
just didn't work in 2020. And you have the list there, demographic and all those different things. Uh, and if the solid schmaybe at the end of all this is uh, that it's possible that pre-election polls were not successful in correctly accounting for new voters who participated in the 2020 election, and so the idea that there were and this would the new voters would be more on Trump's side, that somehow or other Trump got a bunch of people motivated, and there was anecdotal evidence that he got people who were
yeah,
normally just totally not involved in the system, who felt alienated, and brought them on board, and that these people were not accounted for, right? That
mhm,
they weren't anticipated, they didn't get caught, and so this is our solid schmaybe, and they're not sure how to deal with this, right? Because they say that they just do, and the big problem they noted in all their findings was they can't say exactly what happened because the information you have is not there, because you don't know who you didn't interview,
yeah.
right? You don't know who you didn't account for as a new voter, or you can sort of get an idea from exit polls, which they looked at, but uh, there's just not the information here.
Yeah, and there are ways to correct for non-response, and there are
Yeah.
ways to correct for, your missing data problems. But as it turns out, maybe some of those historical methods don't work now, right? That's kind of what I'm hearing. But what that tells me is that the electorate has changed, and it's changed rapidly. It's changed just over and I would say we would need to go back and see how some of the polling played out during Obama's administration to see exactly how far this played out. But I would just safe to say within the last decade, the electorate's probably changed in a way that historical polls, and it's those historical polls that we use to kind of figure out how to correct for you know,
Yeah.
demographic issues and that non-response. So I think that
The
we have a drastically changing, like our electorate has changed drastically in a very short amount of time, and our polls probably haven't caught up to that. You know, I,
or
I had an or also. What's your or?
well, that is one argument. Things have changed, that it's an ongoing trend. Another argument is they changed and they've already adapted, and the 2022 results, which have kind of gone back to what we were looking at earlier here, suggest that there is an argument we can't discredit, that they had problems and they fixed them, right? And that in the move counter move in the development of polling, and uh, you know that they have accounted for them because they did very well in 2022.
Mhm. Here's here's another, just my or was probably
Yeah.
on a related note, but and I'm not a professional pollster, but you think maybe in building up to 2022 we had a lot more junk polls out there?
In building up to 2022, we had
I'm
more.
sorry, 2020, because 2020 was the bad year, right?
Right.
So maybe building up to that, did we have a lot of junk polls that introduced more measurement error?
I don't know. Um, I would have thought that would be an explanation more likely for 2016, because 2016
Mhm.
was when we just where we it's not that we had junk polls, we had no polls
Yeah.
in a lot of places. Did 2020 have that? That's an interesting question, right? Did people trying to deal with the problems perceived in 2016 do some stuff. That wasn't what the
That's not what egg
APOR,
whores
as
say.
the people came up with. But I also like to throw just one little thing in there, and that I felt that they had not mentioned is that 2020. This is my thing. Is like, could it just be that that year was screwed up? And normally you don't like to say, "Hey, look, this is an outlier. This is just weird," right? But at another level, it's like, well, if you're ever going to say that one year was just not representative of all the others,
Mhm.
which one of these things is not like the other?
Yeah.
Uh, it was a Sierra show. As I actually taught my granddaughter to say that Sierra, the military thing. It's a but and that is something I can't discount. That's something
Mhm.
I don't want to hang my hat on this. I like your explanations as well. But there's just this other level. I look at it and go, are we really surprised that 2020 was totally, sideways? And
You know, I think you're onto something, but also like there's a there's an issue that we deal with as social scientists, and it's we cannot explain everything.
Right.
So that's why I'm kind of leaning towards this. I think it was ate up like a soup sandwich. But
Yeah.
I'm also it's making me think of and maybe this gets edited out, and I'll be brief. But when I was deployed and I was doing social science field work in a war zone, I once got handed some survey data, and once I read the collection protocol, I realized that this data had to be falsified, and it was given to us by a contract. And I've written on this, and I have statements in peer-reviewed, published journal article. Um, the company's own collection protocol. When I read it, I'm like, this doesn't seem right. And the reason I knew or I suspected the data were falsified is because I actually lived and worked in that district, and I had connections and I had a network of pretty influential people that would have known if during this particular time period there was a survey organization walking around rural Afghanistan asking people questions. And when
Hmm.
I brought this up to them, they're like, this didn't happen. This is not right. You know, so I often wonder, and that's why I bring that up, because as soon as you put that explanation up there from APOR, I'm reminded. That's why I thought there's a lot of junk out there. There is a lot of garbage. And it is up to us, though, as social scientists, to try to make sense of this. But at the end of the day,
Hmm.
I might just go with your outlier explanation, because that kind of does just,
Yeah.
sometimes our explanations are, this just makes sense, but let's go
And
look at the data and see, you
it's an
know.
outlier that only has to explain. I mean, I said it's all ate up, right? But it's a five instead of a 3.5,
Yeah.
right? I mean, 5% instead of 3.5 error, uh, extra error. And so, it's not actually that. I mean, it's not cray
Mhm.
cray off. It's not, you know, it's a little bit. It's a little bit more off than usual in an election that is closer, because again, close elections are more difficult to predict and more difficult to measure accurately. So, um, but it is interesting here when we look at that to say, hey, what do we? How much do we want to build on these two? It would be 2016 and 2020. How much do we want to put on that? And especially in light of 2022 looking a lot better.
Mhm.
Um, and there's the other question: is it the presence of Trump? Does he do something that affects non-response, that affects how people uh, do that? Is there something? Because that's another factor that when we see him in an election, we have a different thing than normal. And is there a Trump factor as well? There's certainly, COVID factor in 2020, but there was also 2020 and 2016 have Trump in common. So I don't know. We do that. We wait to see. which is the most unsatisfying answer to give me.